an untouched teacup, and a vanished guest list. Welcome to Detective Echoes. I am your host, Graham. Drop a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Your presence truly makes this journey richer. Now, into the mystery. The summer sun filtered through a haze of honeysuckle as the clock struck 3 in the village of Beechwood-on-Tyne. It was a Saturday, the sort that drifted by with the sleepy rhythm only English countryside life could sustain. Birds flitted from one rosebush to another, and somewhere beyond the green a lawnmower hummed like a distant bee. At the vicarage, a trestle table was being unfolded beneath the chestnut tree, while the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Blanche Ellison, fussed over a selection of cucumber sandwiches and sponge cakes that had been arranged with military precision. This was to be the first garden tea of the season, a modest affair, intended to raise funds for new hymnals. The cream-colored invitations had been distributed to most of the village's key residents, the unmarried sisters from the old parsonage, the reclusive clockmaker from Hazel Lane, and even young Mr. Edgar Prothero, the new schoolmaster, who had been much talked about since his arrival in May. But the guest of honor, or rather the organizer behind the scenes, was one Mrs. Petula Harroway of Lavender House. Petula Harroway was the sort of woman whose life resembled a polished silver tray, gleaming, ordered, and vaguely threatening if you looked too long. Her wealth, inherited from a late husband of vague colonial enterprise, afforded her liberties in a town where others still said please before serving milk in their tea. Her garden was the finest, her gossip the freshest, and her hat plumes the tallest. Yet curiously she had not appeared. The tea set had been laid out with its usual porcelain perfection, delicate pink roses painted on bone-white china, a family heirloom said to have been passed down through 3 generations. There were 6 cups, 6 saucers, and 6 side plates, arranged in a tight circle on the wrought iron table beside the hydrangea hedge. A silver teapot gleamed like a mirror, though its spout remained dry. Mrs. Ellison had peered at the empty arrangement and frowned. "Strange," she had murmured. Petula confirmed she'd arrive an hour early to supervise the flower arrangements. It was Miss Jane Marple, sitting somewhat apart with her knitting bag resting on her lap, who remarked mildly, "It's unlike her to be late, especially for something she herself has organized." No one paid her much attention. Miss Marple, after all, was always observing something, petunias, people, or peculiarities in punctuation. By 4 o'clock, the guests had arrived and seated themselves beneath the patchy shade. Cups clinked politely. No one dared ask why the host herself was missing, for in a place like Beechwood-on-Tyne certain questions were like rattling the bones in a family cupboard. But as the clock moved past 4:30, with the sun sliding just a touch more westward, a fidget of unease passed among the ladies like a sudden breeze. Someone whispered that the Harroway maid had been seen running down the hill towards Constable Wedge's cottage. Another muttered something about a doctor's motor car seen turning sharply onto Lavender Lane. It was Miss Marple who quietly rose, not to stir trouble, but because something about that tea set was troubling her, more than the silence. At precisely 5 o'clock, Constable Wedge himself arrived at the vicarage. He removed his hat respectfully and spoke in a tone not intended for village entertainment. "Terribly sorry to intrude, ladies and gents, but I'm afraid there's been, a situation at Lavender House. If you could all remain here for the time being." In the flutter of gasps and half-finished cups, Miss Marple said nothing, but her pale blue eyes, sharp behind their wire-rimmed spectacles, had already turned back to the empty tea set that had been so perfectly arranged, and yet never used. 6 cups, no tea stains, no guests. Just as planned, except for one thing. Someone had set the table for a gathering that never happened, and someone had very good reason for making sure it didn't. The road to Lavender House wound like a ribbon of chalk through the gently rolling hills just outside the village proper, flanked on one side by whispering poplars and on the other by dense hedgerows bristling with late summer bramble. The house itself sat slightly elevated, as if watching the town from a discreet distance, an ivy-clad Edwardian structure with deep eaves, arched windows, and a heavy front door that always seemed to close a little too slowly, as though reluctant to shut. Constable Wedge arrived at the house just moments before the doctor's motor car, but it was the shrill cries of Dotty, Petula Harroway's live-in maid, that had first brought attention. The girl had been found in a peculiar state of distress, hands covered in flour from an abandoned batch of scones, muttering about a dreadful silence and no answer from Madam. By the time Miss Marple reached the edge of the vicarage garden, she could see the uniformed constable returning down the lane to speak again with the Reverend. A crowd of villagers, already thick with speculation, had begun to form at a respectful distance beneath the spreading chestnut tree. The tea set remained untouched. It had become, in that short hour, a sort of silent monument, still arranged, still expectant, still altogether wrong. Miss Marple approached the vicar and his wife with a measured grace. "I wonder," she said mildly, "if someone might look in on young Dotty. If the poor girl's had a fright, a warm shawl and something fortifying might do her good. People so often overlook the needs of the ones who find the body." Mrs. Ellison's eyes widened slightly, but the Reverend nodded. "Yes, yes, of course, I'll see to it." As the crowd thickened with whispers, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the last time she had seen Petula Harroway in person, 4 days ago at the post office, complaining bitterly about the inconsistencies of the village grocer and remarking that someone had been tampering with the privet hedge along her south wall. It was typical Harroway fuss over something others would ignore, yet now that harmless vanity, that self-importance, was conspicuously absent. Lavender House's windows stared back like dull eyes. By 5:30, Dr. Arbuthnot had confirmed what everyone suspected, but no one dared say aloud. Petula Harroway was dead. She had been found seated in her writing chair in the drawing-room, dressed impeccably in a pale lilac gown with a brooch in the shape of a thistle. Her eyes, the doctor said, had been open, but she had not blinked in quite some time. There were no signs of a struggle, he added, once word had reached the vicarage garden. No indication of anything unnatural, save the look on her face. Surprise, I'd say startled. Heart failure perhaps, but I've requested a post-mortem to be safe. The phrase "to be safe" settled over the crowd like the first chill of evening. Miss Marple had not spoken since, but her fingers paused in their knitting just long enough for her to glance at young Edgar Prothero, who was standing alone, beneath the wisteria trellis, sipping tea he had not seemed to want. His eyes were on the vicarage lawn, but his thoughts, she guessed, were elsewhere. Around the garden, conversation crackled like dry leaves. "Shocking, simply shocking," said Mrs. Bostwick from Rose Lane. "But she did always keep herself rather too well for a widow, if you ask me." "Perhaps she overexerted herself preparing the tea," muttered the retired Colonel Trent, who had been heard earlier scoffing at the lack of whiskey. "These sorts of affairs always put a strain on the nervous system." "Rubbish," declared Miss Cowperthwaite, who had once attended a lecture on herbal tonics in Bath, and now fancied herself something of a medical expert. "She was fit as a fiddle. No, there's something more to this, mark my words." They all looked to the Reverend, who cleared his throat and attempted a note of calm. "Friends, please, we mustn't jump to conclusions. Let's wait until the authorities complete their inquiry." But Miss Marple, still seated on the edge of the vicarage's stone bench, observed the group not as a unified flock, but as individuals with diverging trails of worry, guilt, curiosity, and calculation. It was always the little things that told you everything, like the clenching of a jaw when a name was spoken, or the fact that someone had declined a scone not because they disliked them, but because their nerves were rattled. The next morning brought a fog that pressed low over Beechwood-on-Tyne like a damp curtain. Lavender House was officially sealed off by police ribbon, and Constable Wedge had positioned himself near the gate, clutching his notebook and a rather soggy cheese sandwich. In the post office the talk grew wilder. "She had enemies, I'll wager," said the grocer's wife, flattening a brown paper bag with unnecessary vigour. "People resented her, always looking down her nose. I heard she had a gentleman. Caller last month," added Mrs. Lemmings. "Some London sort, wearing gloves in July. Can't trust a man who wears gloves in July." Even the florist, who usually preferred to stay out of village gossip, allowed herself to add, "She cancelled her order last week. Said she didn't want the lilies anymore. Just roses, white ones. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple, passing through the post office to collect her parcel of yarn, took it all in with the calm of someone feeding birds in the park. She thanked Miss Biggs, paid in exact change, and stepped outside to where the morning fog was lifting in threads. She had no intention of meddling, or so she told herself, but in her little drawing-room that afternoon, as she wound skeins of moss-green wool into balls for a shawl she had no real need to finish, Miss Marple mulled over the arrangement of the tea set, the perfectly aligned china, the untouched cups, the silver teapot that had been polished but never poured. One cup had sat ever so slightly askew, the smallest thing, but it meant someone had picked it up and set it down again just a fraction out of line, and that meant someone had intended to drink until something changed, or someone arrived. By Monday morning, the rhythms of Beechwood-on-Tyne resumed, their gentle procession, but not quite as before. The air carried a hum of suspense beneath the usual pleasantries, and even the song of the robins seemed a touch subdued, as if the very birds had paused to listen in on the scandal. The curtains at No. 6 Pinecroft Lane twitched more than usual, and at the grocer's, Mrs. Tillinghurst sold nearly twice her usual quantity of sugar and biscuits, tea being the natural theatre of village speculation. At the heart of the storm, however, sat a vacuum. Lavender House, with its bolted gate and shrouded windows, had become less a residence and more a stage for unanswered questions. "She had no children, did she?" asked Reverend Ellison's housekeeper to no one in particular, placing scones on a plate with the solemnity of a communion offering. "No, only nieces, 2 of them, though I believe one stopped speaking." "To her altogether," Mrs. Ellison replied, brushing crumbs from her apron. "Something about an inheritance dispute. Of course one mustn't assume." "Assumptions are what make the wheels of a village turn, Blanche," the Reverend muttered behind his newspaper, though not without sympathy. At the post office, conversation ran unchecked. Miss Biggs was overheard saying that Dotty, the maid, had taken to her bed and refused to speak to anyone except the doctor and Miss Marple. "Yes, Jane Marple," she whispered over the counter to the clockmaker, "who sat with the poor girl for nearly an hour yesterday, calm as you please. Came out without saying a word, but I swear she was knitting faster than usual. If there was one thing the village understood well, it was that Miss Marple's knitting speed was inversely proportional to the stability of their surroundings. Meanwhile, the constabulary presence remained minimal. Chief Inspector Crayford from Melchester had arrived in a smart dark suit, taken a long look around Lavender House, and interviewed Dotty briefly before retiring to the study for tea with Dr. Arbuthnot and Constable Wedge. His presence was understated, but his notepad, small, square, and of exceptional crispness, became the object of much fascination. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat beneath the climbing clematis with a pot of rosehip tea and her lap full of wool, her manner tranquil, but her thoughts were curiously unsettled. She had noted the quietness of the villagers, especially in those who ordinarily couldn't stop themselves from over-speculating. The colonel, who typically roared with opinion, had grown unusually restrained. Mrs. Cowperthwaite, whose last theory involved Turkish poison rings, was now hesitant. Even young Edgar, Prothero, that overly polite new schoolmaster, had kept his distance since Saturday's abrupt conclusion. It was during this silence that Miss Marple began to assemble her portrait, not of the murder, but of the village itself. The crime, after all, was not separate from its setting. Beechwood-on-Tyne was the sort of place where people rarely left, and when they did, it was with gossip trailing them like a ribbon in the wind. Resentments here aged like fine cheeses, better with time, but no less pungent. And Petula Harroway had touched almost every corner of it. She had funded the new choir robes after the previous ones were deemed too provincial. She had chaired the parish committee and rewritten its minutes when she disliked the decisions. She had given, and just as swiftly rescinded, small loans to various neighbours, always with the faintest hint that repayment might be optional if one's behaviour proved pleasing. And then there were the private affairs. A quiet knock at the vicarage door interrupted Miss Marple's thoughts. It was Mrs. Charlotte Vine, a widow with weathered eyes, and a manner that suggested she had once been beautiful and never quite forgiven the world for moving on. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, smoothing her gloves. "Not at all, Charlotte," Miss Marple replied gently, gesturing to the chair beside her. "Is it tea or a confidant you require?" Mrs. Vine hesitated. "Both, if you don't mind." She sat knees together, posture straight, and spoke slowly. "It's about the tea set, Jane. I noticed something that may mean nothing, but the mind does play tricks when the world becomes unsettled." Miss Marple waited. "I happened to glance at the tea table just before the guests arrived on Saturday. I was early. You know how I like to help Blanche with the napkins, and I saw Petula's tea set already laid out, all in place except, Miss Marple prompted with a softness that rarely failed. There was one cup missing. Only 5 cups, not 6. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it had been forgotten, but then, when I looked again, it was there. All 6. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, letting her gaze drift across the garden. "It is such a peculiar kind of mistake to correct," she murmured. "To begin with 5, and then make it 6, or perhaps the other way around. Do you think it means something?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that when people fuss over appearances, they often reveal what they are trying to hide." Later that afternoon, a chance encounter at the greengrocer's offered another thread. Edgar Prothero stood stiffly by the apples, inspecting them with an intensity normally reserved for exam results. "Good afternoon, Mr. Prothero," Miss Marple said, selecting a pair with deceptive care. "Miss Marple, you're keeping well, I hope." "As well as can be expected," she replied. "Such a shock about Mrs. Harroway, wouldn't you say?" He nodded, but did not meet her gaze. "She was quite influential," Miss Marple continued. "Not always kindly, but then some people mistake authority for virtue." That got his attention. "She could be opinionated," he said carefully. "But she did take an interest in the school, funded our new books, gave advice." Miss Marple smiled. "Advice is a curious currency. We rarely ask for it, yet we always seem to owe something afterward." Prothero gave a tight nod and muttered his goodbyes. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back to the fruit display, though her thoughts were no longer on pears or plums. By evening, word came from Chief Inspector Crayford's office. A preliminary report on the cause of death suggested a cardiac episode possibly triggered by acute stress. There was no poison detected in the body, no signs of trauma. Nothing, in fact, but a woman found sitting peacefully in her own drawing room with a startled look frozen on her face. A natural death, some whispered, but others weren't so sure. In a place like Beechwood-on-Tyne, murder rarely arrived with blood and noise. No, it came in silence, in propriety, in porcelain cups and unsaid words. Miss Marple, stirring her teacup slowly, glanced down at her notes, disguised, as always, in the margins of her knitting patterns. One cup was missing, then one cup appeared, which meant someone had considered not serving a guest at all, or someone else had quietly inserted themselves into a gathering not meant for them. And someone, of course, had reason to make sure Petula Harroway never lifted that teacup at all. The following day broke with a brittle chill, as though the late summer sun had grown cautious of its own warmth. Beechwood-on-Tyne, now 3 days into the quiet chaos of Petula Harroway's death, was a village simultaneously clinging to its routines and glancing over its shoulder. The postman whistled less. The milkman lingered longer than usual at gates, eager for a scrap of conversation, and behind nearly every drawn curtain a pair of eyes watched. But in the constabulary office on the edge of the green, something more, official than whispers, was unfolding. Chief Inspector Crayford stood behind the desk that had belonged to no fewer than 7 previous inspectors, all of whom had managed to keep their postings in sleepy countryside towns precisely because nothing much ever happened. He was not used to tea parties ending in inquiries, and his tone was one of mild irritation as he addressed Constable Wedge. "The heart may have failed, Wedge," he said, tapping his notepad with a pencil that had been sharpened down to a nervous stump. "But I'll be dashed if that expression on the woman's face doesn't suggest she saw something or someone that startled her deeply. I've known plenty of deaths that took place in drawing rooms, but very few where the corpse looked like it had been caught eavesdropping on its own murder." Wedge blinked slowly, uncertain if this was meant to be a metaphor or a direct observation. "So, you think it was murder, sir?" "I think," said Crayford slowly, "that until I'm convinced otherwise, I'm not ruling anything out." It was enough to launch the official questioning, beginning with the most obvious candidate, Dotty, the maid. She was brought into the room still visibly shaken. Her usually tidy apron was wrinkled, and her fingernails bore traces of orange zest, a detail that did not escape Crayford's attention, though he made no comment. "Miss Dotty, Dotty, is it?" he began with a gentle tone that belied his clipped moustache and squared shoulders. "You've served Mrs. Harroway for how long?" 7 years, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a folded handkerchief. "I was with her after the funeral of Mr. Harroway, when she wouldn't let nobody but me trim the hedges or polish the silver." "And what was her state of health lately? Any complaints? Chest pains?" "She said she had a flutter now. And then," Dotty replied, "but never nothing serious. She still took her evening sherry and did her crossword, like the ones from the Times, though she always cheated on Sundays." Crayford leaned forward. "Was she expecting anyone on Saturday?" Dotty hesitated. "Only the tea party at the vicarage. She'd been planning it for weeks, even bought special lavender sugar for the scones." "Did anyone visit Lavender?" "House that morning?" Again the hesitation. "Then there was a man. He came mid-morning. I didn't see his face clearly, only that he wore a tan coat and gloves. Strange, it was quite warm. Madam seemed surprised to see him, but she invited him into the drawing-room and asked me to prepare a tea tray. I didn't hear much after that." "A visitor she wasn't expecting, then?" "I think so, yes." "Did you overhear anything they said?" Dotty shifted uncomfortably. "Only the tone. His voice was sharp, like he was angry. And Madam, well, she spoke low, like she was pleading almost. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the door was ajar when I brought the tea." Crayford scribbled briskly. And then? They stopped talking when I entered. I placed the tray down. There were 2 cups. She told me not to return unless called. You weren't called? No, sir. When I came back 2 hours later to dust the front parlour, she was... Dotty swallowed. She was gone. Crayford folded his notebook slowly. You did well to come forward. She looked at him with watery eyes. I didn't come forward, sir. Miss Marple did. She said I ought to talk to you. Said truth has a way of helping those who don't understand. Hear it yet? Crayford arched an eyebrow. Did she now? Meanwhile, Miss Marple herself was engaged in her own form of investigation, delicate, conversational, and infuriatingly effective. At Bostwick's general store, she found Colonel Trent pacing with a newspaper tucked beneath one arm, looking as though he would have much preferred pacing with a cigar and a revolver. "Colonel," she said pleasantly, "I hear the inspector is hard at work." He huffed. "Good man, Crayford, though I dare say he's got his hands full. Place like this, people keep secrets like biscuits in a tin, always a few hidden at the bottom." Miss Marple chuckled. "Indeed, and some biscuits, I find, are more poisonous than others." He gave her a sharp glance. "What are you getting? At Jane?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said, patting the pocket of her cardigan. "Only I was thinking of Petula's nieces. You must remember them, Annabel and Harriet. They used to visit every summer for a week, until the rather unfortunate falling out." "Humph. Yes, I remember. Annabel was the sharp one. Went off to study law, I believe. Haven't seen her in years. Harriet married that awful financier, the one who ended up in court." "Fraud, wasn't it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Quite. Petula disinherited her after that, or so it's said, but I can't imagine either of them turning up here again, unless they had something to gain." Colonel Trent stiffened. "Do you mean—" "I mean," she said, "that a woman like Petula, with no children and considerable holdings, makes a very interesting puzzle once she dies. Particularly if someone thought they might inherit a piece of the frame." The colonel narrowed his eyes, then turned abruptly and marched off toward the green. That evening, Constable Wedge brought a piece of news to Miss Marple's gate. "Thought you'd like to know, ma'am," he said, shifting nervously. "We found a torn note in Mrs. Harroway's study drawer. Looked like it had been ripped in haste. Read something like, 'Won't be blackmailed. If you show up, I shall call—' and then it ends." Miss Marple accepted the information with a slow nod. "How interesting," she murmured. "So, someone knew she wouldn't be alone that day, and they were warned not to come." She turned to look at the cottage next to hers, where the windows remained dark. "Tell me, Constable, has anyone seen Annabel Harroway in town lately?" Wedge blinked. "Can't say they have. Should we be looking for her?" Miss Marple turned back to her rose bushes. "Oh, I think someone should be," she said softly, "before someone else vanishes." The following morning dawned with the sort of fragile calm that often comes before a thunderclap. A hazy mist still clung to the edges of the village green, curling around the railings of the war memorial and seeping into the hedgerows as if the land itself were holding its breath. The bells from St. Mildred's had not yet rung, but there was already a subtle electricity in the air. At Lavender House the shutters remained closed, though the police ribbon had been removed overnight. The villagers took this as an unspoken signal that the official presence was receding, that the death of Mrs. Petula Harroway might, after all, prove to be just what the doctor first suspected, a natural, if sudden, expiration. But Miss Marple had not spent her life knitting lace cardigans for infants and scarves for the Women's Institute without learning to recognize the pattern of lies woven into the threads of public silence. She had, in fact, spent much of the early morning hour in her sitting room, carefully reviewing the pattern repeats of a shawl she wasn't sure she even wanted to complete. The lacework on her needles was intricate, meant to resemble fallen rose petals. But her mind remained firmly fixed not on motifs, but on movements, specifically who had entered and exited Lavender House that day, and why the sixth cup had appeared on the tea table after it had initially been absent. There was also, of course, the torn note, "Won't be blackmailed. If you show up, I shall call—" That simple phrase had done more to shift the tide of the investigation than any official interview or medical statement. A threat of blackmail was rarely idle, and Miss Marple, who had observed her fair share of veiled pasts and conveniently forgotten sins, knew that once such threats were spoken aloud, or worse, written down, the circle of suspicion began to constrict. She dressed warmly that morning and took her cane, though she didn't strictly require it. There was always something useful about the image of a fragile old lady walking politely about with a cane. It gave her license to pause at gates, linger at hedgerows, and tilt her head thoughtfully at windows without appearing nosy. People tended to forget that her eyes behind those gentle spectacles missed very little. By mid-morning she arrived, quite by chance, as she later explained, at the gravel path leading through the back gardens of Lavender House. The constable on duty recognized her immediately, and although there was a moment's hesitation, Miss Marple's unassuming air and her soft murmur of "just tending to the parish rose samples along the south wall, they were gifted by the Harraways after all," smoothed the way. Lavender House's rear garden had been one of Petula's proudest achievements. Clipped boxwood borders framed beds of delphiniums and lavender, but the standout was always the lilac walk, a short gravel path between two great swaying hedges of lilac, which bloomed furiously each May and were now in leaf, green and humming with insects. It was along this path under the filtered morning light that Miss Marple paused. There, partially obscured by a spray of bristling green, lay something faintly out of place. She stooped slowly, not to draw attention, and with the pretense of tugging at her stocking, she retrieved a small, crumpled object. A scrap of pale blue paper, smudged but still faintly scented, as if once stored near perfume. She flattened it between her fingers. The writing was in a hurried, slanting hand, different from Petula's spidery script. Too dangerous now. If she's spoken to anyone, it's ruined. We'll wait for instructions. A. Miss Marple blinked slowly. A. That was hardly conclusive, and yet the letter matched the initials of the niece, Annabel. The ink appeared. Recent, perhaps no older than a week. Miss Marple pocketed the scrap without drawing attention to herself and retraced her steps back to the road, where the baker's boy tipped his cap and Mrs. Cowperthwaite passed on the opposite pavement with a look of contained curiosity. Miss Marple returned the greeting as if she had not a care in the world. At home she settled in with the note, holding it carefully against the light. No watermark, no date. But the scent, something faintly exotic, lavender with a metallic edge, reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. Before she had time to dwell on it, there came a knock at her door. It was Edgar Prothero. He stood on the threshold, hands nervously clasped behind his back, wearing the expression of a man both eager and ashamed to be visiting. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said, ushering him. "Do come in, tea?" He hesitated. "Yes, thank you." She prepared the tray swiftly, placing it on the table near the lace curtains. He accepted his cup without milk, his fingers trembling slightly. I don't quite know how to begin," he said. "It's just, well, there's something I must confess." Miss Marple waited, her expression kindly, her teacup poised, but untouched. "I knew Mrs. Harraway before I came to Beechwood," he said at last. "That is, I met her in London once, several years ago. I had applied for a teaching position at a private academy where she happened to be a patroness. She was influential, intimidating, in fact, but she took an interest in my work and, well, offered assistance. What sort of assistance? He coloured slightly. Financial. She helped settle my final term fees when I was short, but there was an understanding that I would repay her. Miss Marple tilted her head. Repay her in what way? Prothero swallowed. With loyalty. She was a woman who expected favours returned. When I moved here and she discovered I was teaching in her village, she began to suggest things, that I could keep an eye on certain people, that I could report matters to her. He looked down at his lap, ashamed. I didn't always comply, but she had a way of reminding one that favours come with strings. Last week she asked me to inquire into Miss Vine, Charlotte Vine, and her affairs. Wanted to know if Charlotte had a man visiting late. Miss Marple raised one eyebrow. And did she? Prothero looked startled. Not that I could tell. I refused to look further. It felt wrong. And then she said if I didn't help her, she might speak to the school board. About my debts, about how I'd gotten the position. She made it sound like I'd lied on my application, though I hadn't. But I panicked. Miss Marple nodded slowly, digesting his confession. It was plausible. It rang true, especially in the tone of someone confessing not murder, but moral cowardice. And where were you on Saturday morning? At home. I'd written a note to her saying I wanted no further involvement. I put it in her letterbox. He faltered. I don't know if she read it. Miss Marple stirred her tea. And did you sign it? His lips parted, then closed again. He looked up at her, his face pale. With an A? She asked quietly. He gasped. How did you... She held up a hand. Never mind. That tells me enough. He left shortly after, eyes filled with worry. Miss Marple, once again alone, sat in the quiet with her cooling tea and thought of the note in the lilac bush. 2 A's in the village with reasons to hide, and now one more cup, she suspected, that had never been meant to serve a guest at. All. That afternoon brought with it a rare spell of warmth, one of those fleeting surges of English sunshine that set the bees buzzing and coaxed the scent of cut grass into the lanes. But in Beechwood-on-Tyne, no one seemed to notice the weather. The mystery of Petula Harroway's death had settled like pollen across the village, clinging to conversations and clouding even the most innocuous interactions. At the heart of this restless calm sat Lavender House, sealed, silent, and full of unanswered questions. Miss Marple took her afternoon walk earlier than usual. With each careful step down the village lane, she passed signs of polite tension. Mrs. Cowperthwaite speaking in hushed tones to the butcher's wife, young Mr. Prothero passing by with a notebook pressed too tightly to his chest, and Charlotte, Vine seated alone beneath the great sycamore by the library, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. There was something about Charlotte that Miss Marple had always noted, an elegance edged with restraint, a woman who had once known adoration and had since learned to survive on its memory. Miss Marple approached with the air of an old friend. "Good afternoon, Charlotte. I hope I'm not intruding." Charlotte gave a slight smile. "Not at all, Jane. I was simply resting my thoughts." Miss Marple sat beside her on the bench, her hands folded over her cane. Resting thoughts is a practice too few embrace. They sat in silence for a few moments, the breeze rustling the pages of a discarded newspaper at their feet. "It must feel strange," Miss Marple said at last, "to be so near and yet so apart from what's happened. You and Petula were never quite close, were you?" Charlotte turned slightly, her smile growing brittle. "She had no close friends, Jane, only instruments and ornaments." "That sounds harsh." "It's the sort of truth that passes for rudeness," Charlotte murmured, "but I doubt anyone will challenge it now." Miss Marple did not respond directly. Instead, she watched the wind stir the ivy on the nearby library wall. "Tell me, my dear," she said gently. "Did you have a visitor last week? Someone from London, perhaps?" Charlotte's hand stiffened slightly in her lap. "No," she said, but too quickly. Then, after a pause, "That is, only briefly. My cousin Arnold. He was passing through on business." "Arnold Vine?" Miss Marple asked with casual interest. Charlotte shook her head. "Arnold Graves, my mother's side. He's quite dull, really. Couldn't tell a scandal from a shopping list." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of mild agreement. "And did he perhaps wear gloves? In July?" Charlotte's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, it's only something I heard mentioned, that someone had called on Petula last week wearing gloves. Quite unusual, I thought." Charlotte said nothing. Miss Marple patted her arm. "Do take care, dear. Not all visitors come with good intentions, and not all secrets stay buried." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the church to speak briefly with Reverend Ellison. The vicar was in his study, rearranging hymnals and looking as though the weight of recent events had crept into his spine. "You've heard, I imagine," he said without preamble, "that Crayford has begun pursuing the matter of the inheritance." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. It appears Mrs. Harroway made several changes to her will over the past year. I imagine the solicitor's eyes are rather strained at this point." "She left a sizable portion to an unnamed recipient," the vicar said. "A sealed envelope, held in trust, only to be opened in the event of her untimely death. That's how the clause reads." Miss Marple's knitting needles would have paused at that sentence had she been carrying them. "Curious phrasing," she said. "One doesn't often use the word untimely unless one anticipates interruption." The vicar sighed. "Do you believe she anticipated foul play?" Miss Marple met his gaze evenly. "I believe she anticipated many things. She had the instincts of a tactician, not merely a hostess." It was late afternoon when she returned home. She poured herself a modest sherry and sat near the window overlooking the vicarage garden. The day's warmth was fading, the light softening to amber. The puzzle was beginning to take shape in her mind, but the corner pieces were still missing. And so the next morning Miss Marple returned once more to Lavender House. This time she had arranged to meet Constable Wedge, who had, after much coaxing and a lemon curd tart, agreed to let her inspect the conservatory. The conservatory was a place of pride for Petula Harroway. Its tiled floor was an imitation of Roman mosaic, its shelves stacked with orchids and miniature citrus trees. The glass walls, though now smudged with dust, still caught the morning sun in golden fragments. It was here, not in the drawing-room, that Miss Marple believed the final significant conversation had taken place. "Mind your step, ma'am," Wedge muttered as they entered. She moved slowly, her eyes trailing the perimeter. "There," she said softly, pointing to a small metal stool near the eastern window. "Has that been moved?" Wedge scratched his head. "Don't believe so." Miss Marple moved closer. On the tile beneath the stool was a faint scuff, barely visible unless one looked carefully. Near it a tiny shard of glass, no larger than a fingernail. "Not from the conservatory windows," she murmured. "They're thick, tempered." She retrieved the shard with a handkerchief, wrapping it delicately. "Ma'am, what are you thinking?" Wedge asked cautiously. "I'm thinking someone dropped a perfume bottle, or perhaps a vial of something else, something meant to calm or to kill." She turned and pointed to the shelves nearby, cluttered with gardening tools and potting jars. "Check those for anything out of place. especially anything that doesn't belong in a garden. Wedge nodded and began his search. Miss Marple, meanwhile, approached a wooden shelf where various items had been dusted recently, but not all. There, tucked behind a pot of dried lavender, was a folded piece of cloth. She drew it out carefully. It was a linen handkerchief, finely stitched, but stained faintly with something brownish red. Not blood, she thought. Tea, perhaps. Or sherry. Or something more medicinal. In one corner, embroidered initials H.G. She stared at it for a long time. Not Annabel, not Edgar, not Charlotte, but someone else entirely. Miss Marple folded the handkerchief and tucked it into her bag. As she stepped out into the sunlight once more, she let her eyes travel up the garden path, past the lilacs and toward the vicarage roof beyond. A guest had come to the house that day, a guest no one had expected, a guest who may not have even been on the invitation list, yet whose initials were embroidered in linen, whose presence was now imprinted in glass and whose motive, perhaps, had nothing to do with inheritance, but something more immediate, something desperate, and something deadly. The following day began with the uneasy hush of a storm held back by stubborn clouds. In Beechwood-on-Tyne, such atmospheric restraint was rare, and it cast a peculiar pallor over the village lanes, as though even the bricks and hedgerows were holding their breath. Though no new proclamation had come from Melchester, everyone knew something had shifted. Something subtle but unmistakable, like a new actor arriving on stage halfway through the second act. Miss Marple rose early. She had barely finished her buttered toast when her telephone rang. It was Reverend Ellison, his voice strained and low. "Jane, forgive the early call, but I thought you might wish to know. Harriet Gibbons has returned to the village. She arrived late last night. Apparently, she's staying with Charlotte Vine." Miss Marple's grip on the receiver tightened slightly. "Harriet," she repeated, her voice soft. "How very unexpected." "She claims she only just heard the news about her aunt," the Reverend continued, "though, of course, one can't help wondering about the timing. "I'll call on Charlotte later this morning," Miss Marple said. "But thank you, Vicar. You were right to tell me." She replaced the receiver and stared out the window. The garden was bathed in a strange golden-grey light. Birds moved hesitantly between the trees. Harriet Gibbons, the niece who had been quietly removed from her aunt's will after her husband, one Leonard Gibbons, formerly of Gibbons and Dunn merchant bankers, had been convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to 6 years in prison. Petula Harroway had not only cut Harriet off, but, by all accounts, done so with relish. Yet now, just days after Petula's death, Harriet had returned, unannounced, uninvited, and choosing to lodge with the one woman in the village who seemed always to be orbiting the center of things while keeping her own heart hidden. Charlotte Vine. Miss Marple left her cottage at 10:30. She wore a dove-grey wool coat and carried a wicker basket containing a jar of quince jam. A seemingly innocent offering, but one that provided perfect excuse for a doorstep visit. Charlotte answered in her usual composed manner, though her eyes flickered when she saw the visitor. "Jane," she said, "what a lovely surprise. I was passing by and thought you might enjoy a bit of this year's quince batch," Miss Marple said mildly. "I know how fond you are of sharper preserves." Charlotte smiled politely. "Won't you come in?" Miss Marple stepped inside. The drawing-room was tidy, the curtains half-drawn. Seated by the fireplace was a woman in her early 40s, with auburn hair swept back from a face that might once have been called pretty, but now bore the distinct pallor of someone who had spent too long learning how to mask desperation. "Miss Marple," Harriet Gibbons said, rising from her chair, "I believe we met some years ago at the Founders' Day fete." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, offering a warm, if not entirely unguarded, smile. "You were selling violets." "Near the cake stall." "I remember," Harriet said. "You had such a gift for guessing weights. Won a Dundee cake without even lifting the tin." Miss Marple chuckled. "Oh, I've always had an eye for little details, often more reliable than scales." Charlotte poured tea, while Miss Marple seated herself. "We were just discussing Petula's orchids," Charlotte said. "Harriet wanted to pay her respects at Lavender House, but it remains closed." "How very thoughtful," Miss Marple murmured. "Though one might think the news would have reached you a touch earlier." Harriet's mouth tightened. "I was abroad, Spain. A friend offered me a quiet place to recover. I've had a rather difficult year." "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "I expect you hadn't heard about the inheritance either." Harriet blinked. "What inheritance?" Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, watching closely. "Oh, just village. Whispers, I'm afraid. Something about a sealed letter in the solicitor's safe, to be opened only in the event of Petula's untimely death." Charlotte's cup paused mid-air. Harriet remained still, though her eyes flared. "I hadn't heard that," she said evenly. "Curious wording, don't you think?" Miss Marple continued. "Untimely implies anticipation, or perhaps fear." No one spoke for a moment. Then Charlotte, ever poised, changed the subject. "Jane, you're always so perceptive. Have the police determined whether anything was unusual in Petula's final hours?" "Oh, not officially," Miss Marple replied, "though I did hear there may have been a visitor that morning. A man in a tan coat? Wore gloves, I'm told." Harriet set down her cup too quickly, and a few drops splashed onto the saucer. Miss Marple pretended not to notice. "Well," she said, standing, "I won't keep you from your tea." "Thank you both for indulging an old lady's curiosity." As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple's mind hummed with threads pulling tighter. Harriet had lied about when she arrived. Miss Marple was certain of it. The suitcase near the umbrella stand had a worn luggage tag with a rail station sticker marked Paddington, 13 AUG. The 12th had been the day of the garden tea. And then there was the linen handkerchief, initials HG Harriet Gibbons. The timing, the motive, the sudden reappearance, it all pointed toward her. And yet, something did not settle. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Dr. Arbuthnot, under the pretense of asking after her lumbago. "I must confess," she said as he wrote out a recommendation for an herbal poultice, "I've been curious about Petula's state in her final days. Did she seem different to you?" The doctor frowned. "In truth, yes. She came to see me twice in the fortnight before her death. Said she wasn't sleeping. Complained of being watched." "By whom?" "She wouldn't say, only that there were things she regretted, that someone had come back into her life and she was unsure what they wanted." Miss Marple thanked him and returned home. She sat for a long time in her favourite chair by the window, the fading light casting sharp angles across the room. Her eyes wandered to the linen handkerchief again, now folded neatly beside her knitting bag. Harriet Gibbons fit too neatly into the box. It was all too obvious. And Miss Marple knew from long experience that when the pieces of a puzzle arranged themselves too quickly, one had best check the edges again, especially when there was another name no one had thought to mention. Griffith. Horace Griffith. A solicitor. An old friend. A man once discreetly associated with Petula Harraway's late husband. A man whose initials matched. And a man who, unlike Harriet, had not been seen in the village in over a decade. Until just perhaps now. It was the following Thursday that Miss Marple, already suspecting the solution was close yet elusively tangled, made a quiet visit to the Melchester Registry Office. It had taken her the better part of a day to arrange a discreet appointment with an old acquaintance, Miss Cartwright, who handled archival records with the kind of dry precision that made librarians and spinsters a formidable breed indeed. They had shared a pot of slightly bitter tea in the records room, the air thick with the scent of leather-bound ledgers and musty envelopes. Miss Marple, through her usual blend of politeness and well-placed curiosity, inquired about recent travel, records associated with one Horace Griffith. "I do recall the name," Miss Cartwright said, pulling out a registry from under the desk. "Used to be a solicitor, didn't he? Quiet, fastidious type. Had something to do with colonial banking during the war." "Let me see." Miss Marple waited patiently as the pages turned. "Here it is," Miss Cartwright said at last. "Griffith, Horace Edwin, London address, though a temporary one. Interesting. He filed a rural guest stay in Beechwood-on-Tyne just last week, staying at the Hatherley Arms Room 4 only for 2 nights. Miss Marple blinked. "The Hatherley Arms?" "Yes. Checked in on the Wednesday before the tea party. Checked out Friday morning, just before Petula died." Miss Cartwright nodded. "Left no forwarding address, but the payment was made in cash. Unusual these days, even for gentlemen of his generation." Back in Beechwood-on-Tyne, Miss Marple moved with the deliberate caution of someone weaving between brittle glass figurines. She said nothing of her discovery, not even to the vicar, but she did visit the Hatherley Arms that afternoon and had a quiet word with Mr. Varnum, the innkeeper. He, a man not known for discretion, recalled the guest well. "Tall fellow," he said. "Grey at the temples, well-spoken, didn't give his business. Read the papers each morning, didn't leave many footprints." "Did he have any visitors?" Miss Marple asked. Varnum scratched his chin. "Not that I saw, but there was something odd. He asked for his breakfast to be brought up both mornings. Not many do that here, not unless they've something to hide, or someone to avoid." Miss Marple left with a small tin of honey for politeness' sake, and walked past the green, where Colonel Trent was engaged in an animated conversation with Constable Wedge. She did not stop, but the names she overheard, Gibbons, Griffith, Vine, told her enough. The storm was circling closer now, and the village could feel it. That evening Charlotte Vine paid her a visit. She arrived just after sunset, her silhouette delicate in the amber light. "Jane," she said softly, "do you have a moment?" "Of course, Charlotte. Come in. I was just putting the kettle on." Charlotte removed her gloves with slow precision and sat at the edge of the fireside chair, her eyes reflecting, both strength and an undercurrent of tightly wound fatigue. "I've made a mistake," she said without preamble. Miss Marple poured the tea without asking. "It's about Harriet," Charlotte continued. "I shouldn't have taken her in." Miss Marple said nothing. "She arrived days before she claimed," Charlotte admitted. "I saw her on the Thursday evening. She was in a dreadful state. She said she needed somewhere to stay, that she wanted to speak to her aunt, but feared being turned away. I didn't ask questions. I should have." "Did she visit Petula before the garden tea?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't know. She left for a walk Friday afternoon and returned late, but said nothing." "And the man," Miss Marple said quietly, "the one in the tan coat." Charlotte's eyes dropped. "I didn't see him, but I did notice a scent. Lavender. Cologne, very faint, lingering on Harriet's coat. And a linen handkerchief fell from her purse later that evening. It had initials on it, but she swept it away before I could read them." Miss Marple stirred her tea, the pattern forming slowly in her mind. Harriet had been lying, but not about everything. The handkerchief Miss Marple had found in the conservatory, marked H.G., had almost certainly not belonged to Harriet. Gibbons. The stitching was old-fashioned, male, and the scent, lavender with a metallic edge, matched the one Charlotte had mentioned, which meant Horace Griffith had visited Lavender House, and he had left something behind. But why? Miss Marple retired early that evening, and rose even earlier the next day, walking to the solicitor's office where Petula Haraway's will was being handled. She requested, very politely, to review the non-confidential codicils and to leave. A message for the solicitor in charge, Mr. Finlay, who had taken over Griffith's former practice. She left him a note. I would appreciate a quiet conversation regarding the sealed clause in Mrs. Haraway's will. As you know, I'm a student of pattern and human behavior, and I believe Mrs. Haraway left one final message for those who could read it. Later that afternoon she received a telephone call. Mr. Finlay, though skeptical, had been intrigued. He had checked the clause again, and, astonishingly, the envelope containing the sealed instruction for the unnamed beneficiary had gone missing. Only the sealed flap and signature sheet remained in the safe. The contents, Petula's final words, were gone. Miss Marple hung up slowly. Someone had removed the clause, someone who had access to the solicitor's safe, or someone who had written it. That evening, as dusk deepened into a plum-coloured night, she found herself walking along Lavender Lane once more. The house was still and quiet. A single oil lamp burned in one window, the conservatory, and standing inside, visible only in silhouette, was a tall figure. Not Harriet, not Charlotte. A man. She approached softly, the gravel path muffled by a layer of recent rain. The side door creaked slightly as she tested it. It was unlocked. She stepped inside. The scent struck her first, lavender, warm and sharp. And something else, spilled spirits perhaps. She crept forward. The figure turned. Horace Griffith. A little older than she recalled, more lined, more sunken around the eyes, but unmistakable. He stared at her without speaking, then finally said, "I should have known it would be you." Miss Marple nodded. "You often were a step too subtle, Mr. Griffith." He sighed and sank into the wicker chair near the hydrangeas. "She was going to name me," he said, "in the sealed clause. I helped her husband avoid ruin during the war. She said she owed me everything." "And you believed her," Miss Marple said gently. "I did. But then she hesitated, said she might reconsider, that perhaps someone more deserving should benefit." "You knew about Harriet's return?" "Yes, she begged Petula for forgiveness. Petula told her no, flatly, coldly." "You were there the day she died," Miss Marple said. He looked away. "Yes." "Did you kill her?" His breath caught. "No. But I saw someone who may. Had when I left the conservatory, I passed by the lilac path. I saw a shadow, someone entering the side door. I didn't look. I didn't want to know." Miss Marple stared at him for a long time. "Then you understand," she said at last, "that your silence has become part of the crime." He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm afraid, Mr. Griffith," she replied. "That sorry is a word often spoken too late." The night after Miss Marple's encounter with Horace Griffith was one of heavy rain and wind, the sort that battered garden gates and stripped early apples from the trees. In Beechwood on Tyne, lamplight flickered through the storm like secrets trying to escape a shuttered house. But inside Miss Marple's modest cottage, all was still. The fire burned low, and in her sitting room she sat motionless, eyes unfocused, the pieces of the puzzle turning quietly in her mind. She believed Horace. At least she believed he had not intended murder. But she also believed he was hiding something more than pride or embarrassment. Something about the clause, in the will. He had not only known of its existence, he had feared it, and someone else had feared it too. It was not the inheritance itself, Miss Marple reflected, but what that clause might have revealed that was truly dangerous. The following morning, brought with it a chill that seemed out of season. By 10 o'clock the clouds had broken, but the village remained subdued. Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicarage, under the excuse of delivering a small pot of damson jelly, but in truth to speak privately with Reverend Ellison. "Vicar," she said gently as they stood in the narrow hallway, "do you recall the harvest fete from 3 years ago? The one with the archery competition?" The Reverend blinked. "Of course, you took second prize in the jam division, and Mrs. Harroway caused a stir by accusing the judge of favoritism." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "And do you remember who manned the paper stall?" He thought for a moment. Charlotte Vine and, oh, what was his name? Graham. Henry Graham. Miss Marple's eyes lit faintly. Henry Graham. That's the name I couldn't recall. A cousin of Charlotte's, wasn't he? Yes, odd fellow, very quiet. I believe he passed through the village several times that year. And hasn't been seen since? The Reverend frowned. Not that I know of. Miss Marple thanked him and left the vicarage with brisker steps than usual. The name had triggered something. She returned home and began leafing through her correspondence drawer, a box of notes, invitations, and clippings meticulously organized by year and subject. It was in the section marked Fate Programs and Notices that she found what she was looking for, a folded cream card with a faded cornflower crest. The Harvest Fete, 1957. Inside, in clear block type, were the names of all event volunteers. There it was, H. Graham, paper stool 3 to 5 p.m. Next to it, in Charlotte Vine's handwriting, a small scribble, stand-in from London. Reliable. Miss Marple set the card aside. Reliable, she murmured. For what exactly? The same. Afternoon, Chief Inspector Crayford came to call. She received him with her usual kindness, poured tea, and offered a plate of currant buns. "I understand you've been speaking with Horace Griffith," Crayford said, cutting to the point as usual. "I have," she replied, "and I believe he's guilty of cowardice, not murder." Crayford grunted. "That may be so, but I've spoken to the solicitor. The sealed clause is indeed missing. Griffith had opportunity, perhaps motive, perhaps more than he admits." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "You haven't arrested him?" "No, I'm not convinced he's the key to it, but I am convinced the answer lies somewhere in Lavender House, or its people." Miss Marple nodded. "Do you know if anyone has searched Petula's personal files?" Crayford raised an eyebrow. "Files?" "Letters, diaries, correspondence. She was meticulous. She kept everything. And she had a habit of recording private grudges under the guise of observations." The inspector left shortly thereafter, with a renewed plan to request a thorough search of the house. Miss Marple, meanwhile, went to visit the one person she had not yet spoken to in confidence, Dotty the maid. The girl had remained mostly sequestered since the incident, staying with her cousin in a cottage on the edge of the village. Miss Marple arrived with a tin of toffee and an envelope of pressed violets. Dotty was pale but lucid. "I should have said more earlier," she murmured as they sat in the tiny parlour, "but I was scared, Miss Marple. That morning, before Madam passed, I found her tearing up letters, old ones, and she was crying. Do you know what they said?" Dotty nodded. "One of them was from a man. He said he had done what she asked, but now he wanted his name cleared." "Did she mention a name?" "No, but I saw initials, H.G. Miss Marple gently opened her handbag and drew out the linen handkerchief. "This one?" Dotty stared, then nodded. "Yes, that's the one." Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to Lavender House, this time accompanied by Crayford and Wedge. With the necessary legal authority, they searched the study. It was behind a false panel in the writing desk that Crayford discovered a bundle of old letters tied with blue ribbon. They were addressed to Petula Harroway, written in a flowing but faded script, all signed H.G. The letters spoke of transactions. Not money, but silence. You told me to keep quiet about the bank. I did, but it wasn't just Leonard. The books were tampered with. If I take the fall, I expect compensation. You promised my name wouldn't be included in the inquiry, but the solicitor suspects. If this continues, I'll expose everything. If I'm not in the will, then I have nothing left, and I will speak. This is your last chance. Miss Marple looked up from the last letter, her eyes calm but resolute. They're not from Horace Griffith, she said quietly. Crayford stared. Then who? She picked up the envelope again, the final letter. She tilted it toward the lamp. See here, she pointed to a watermark. It's from a firm in Clerkenwell, no longer in operation, but I recall Mr. Henry Graham worked there. Briefly, before he disappeared. Crayford frowned. But we've no record of him. No official one, Miss Marple said. Because he changed his name. She turned to Dotty, who stood nearby, wide-eyed. You saw Harriet return early, but someone else came too, didn't they? Dotty nodded slowly. A man. Quiet. He came through the side garden. Miss Marple turned. Back to the inspector. I believe Henry Graham was Charlotte Vine's cousin. But not only that. He was once involved in the same fraudulent accounts that sank Harriet's husband's firm. He covered for Leonard Gibbons. And when things began to unravel, Petula paid him to disappear. Crayford stepped back. You think he returned to claim what he believed he was owed? I do, Miss Marple said. And I believe he confronted Petula that morning. She refused him. He threatened her. But she was prepared. She had already changed the clause in her will to expose him. His name was to be named in disgrace. And he knew, Crayford asked. He suspected. And when he saw the sealed letter in her desk, he panicked. The silence in the room deepened. Miss Marple folded the last letter slowly. I do not believe he intended to kill her, but I believe the shock of his threat, the knowledge that he might burn everything down out of desperation, was enough. Her heart gave out. He simply watched her die, and took the clause from the safe before fleeing. Crayford's face was grave. And where is he now? That, Miss Marple said, is the final piece we must find. But as she left Lavender House that evening, she knew this much. The guest who had not been invited, the cup that had not been meant to serve, and the truth buried among dusty letters. These were all part of the same thread, and the end of it was still knotted, somewhere very close to home. The morning after the letters were found, the village awoke to a peculiar stillness, as if the landscape itself was bracing for revelation. Clouds hung like low wool over the fields, and the hedges were slick with dew, their silence thick as breath held too long. Word had begun to seep, quietly, carefully, about the man who may have come and gone unnoticed, a name mentioned once and then forgotten. Henry Graham, a ghost among the living. Miss Marple had risen before 6. By the time the baker's bell rang at 8:30, she was already seated at her window with a fresh notebook and her knitting basket untouched beside her. She had drawn a map, not of places, but of moments. The Wednesday of the guest's arrival, the Thursday of Harriet's secret return, the Friday of the clause, and the Saturday of the untouched tea set. Every line led not to a motive, but to a reaction. The panic of a man watching a door close forever, and the calm of a woman preparing to shut it herself. At 10 o'clock, Crayford arrived at her cottage. We've traced the letters, he said without preamble. The stationery came from a tailor's in Clerkenwell, long since closed, but it used to supply luxury materials. We even found an account ledger, and yes, Henry Graham ordered from them in 1956. Miss Marple nodded. And did your inquiry include any indication of his current whereabouts? The inspector hesitated. "No confirmed address, but we found a booking 2 weeks ago. Train from London Paddington to Melchester. No return recorded." "Miss—" Marple set down her tea. "Then I believe I may have a suggestion." She handed him a list, 6 places where she suspected Graham may have gone to ground. Not obvious ones, not city boarding houses or registered lodges, but quiet places easily overlooked, a gamekeeper's shed in Kingswell Wood, the disused stables behind the old blacksmith's cottage, and the top floor of a converted barn behind Miss Frere's dairy. "Why those?" Crayford asked. "Because—" "That's where I would hide," she said simply, "if I wanted to stay close enough to watch." 2 hours later, Graham was found, hungry, exhausted, and crouched in the rafters of the Freer barn, wrapped in a mildewed blanket. His expression, when the inspector and Constable Wedge arrived, was one of resignation rather than surprise. "I thought I had more time," he said quietly as they led him down. "I thought she'd burn the letters." Miss Marple was waiting at the station house when they brought him in. She entered the interview room alone. Crayford had agreed to let her speak first, on the condition that she report everything. Graham looked up as she entered. His face was sallow and lined, the grey at his temples giving him a look more scholarly than sinister. "You remember me?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "You judged the jams, gave me second prize for raspberry." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Your wife submitted the entry, I believe. You stood behind her, watching her every move. You never said a word that day." Graham said nothing. "Why return now?" she asked gently. "After all these years—" "She owed me," he said simply. "She promised. I took the fall so Leonard Gibbons wouldn't. I signed documents I didn't understand, lost my position, my pension. Then she turned around and struck me from the will." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "you didn't kill her." He looked at her sharply. "I frightened her. I wanted to frighten her. I didn't know she had a heart condition." "She was afraid," Miss Marple said, "of being exposed. Yes, but more of losing the mask she had worn so carefully for decades." He looked down. "I went through the side garden. I waited by the lilacs. When I saw her go to the conservatory, I followed. We spoke. She was icy, dismissive. I threatened to tell everything. She stood up, said she would write me out publicly, and that I was nothing but a wart from another lifetime. Then she just went silent." "You didn't call for help?" "No." Miss Marple sighed. "You stole the letter." "Yes, I thought if I could make it vanish, no one would know what had happened. I left the way I came." Miss Marple nodded, then turned to go. At the door she paused. "Are you left behind a handkerchief?" she said. Clumsy for a man so careful, he managed a rueful smile. Even ghosts have habits. Later that afternoon, Crayford took Miss Marple aside. "We have our man," he said, "but we wouldn't have found him without your insight." Miss Marple waved it away. "You would have eventually, but in such matters timing is everything." "What will happen to him?" she asked. "Manslaughter, most likely, unless the judge is particularly sympathetic." Miss Marple said nothing. Her thoughts were already elsewhere. That evening she visited Lavender House once more. Charlotte Vine was there, overseeing the final inventory of her friend's belongings before the estate could be transferred. They stood together in the conservatory, the evening light slanting gold against the glass. "She was my friend," Charlotte said, "but she frightened me." "She frightened most people, Miss," Marple said gently. "I often wondered how she lived so long without love." Miss Marple turned to her. "She didn't," she said. "She lived a very long time with the memory of love. It's not the same." Outside, a breeze stirred the lilacs. As Miss Marple walked back down the garden path, her eyes caught once. More on the tea set, still boxed unused since that fateful Saturday. 6 cups, 1 misaligned, and 1 guest too many. A tea party that had never been poured, only prepared for, with care, precision, and the promise of civility. But behind it all, the truth had been brewing far longer, and now at last it had been served. The village of Beechwood-on-Tyne, having stirred restlessly under the weight of whispers and unanswered questions, began to quiet again, but not completely. The storm had passed, but not without leaving its mark. It wasn't just the crumbling of reputations or the slow tidying up of legal papers at the solicitor's office. It was subtler than that. The very tone of conversation had changed. People still greeted each other on the green and passed scones at the Women's Institute, but now their smiles were slightly slower, their words touched with caution. Petula Harroway had not been beloved, but she had been entrenched, woven tightly into the rituals of the village, like ivy on old stone. Her death and all that had clung to it had pulled back a curtain, and behind it no one had stood blameless. Miss Marple sat in the window of her parlour the morning after the inquest was concluded. The verdict had been clear enough: natural causes, exacerbated by emotional trauma. The court would not press charges against Henry Graham. There had been no evidence of violence, no direct intent. The letters were entered as proof of coercion, not of crime. The missing will clause remained unproven in its contents, and so, by the narrowest margin, justice slipped through the cracks, barely touched, yet unmistakably felt. What remained was something more enduring, the truth that people, even in small villages, even among hydrangeas and hymnals, could make choices they believed they'd buried long ago. There was a knock at the door. It was Charlotte Vine. She entered quietly, dressed in pale grey, her gloves in her hand rather than on them. "I've just come from Lavender House," she said, settling into the chair opposite Miss Marple. "The solicitor has begun cataloguing the estate. Harriet left this morning, early, without saying goodbye." Miss Marple nodded. "I imagine she had little appetite for farewells." Charlotte hesitated. She said something strange before she left. She said she felt as though she'd been punished for sins she hadn't yet committed. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "That often happens to those who carry other people's guilt," she said. "But it's a dangerous feeling. It can lead to the very thing one feared." Charlotte looked down. She tried, in her way. She truly wanted Petula's forgiveness. But that woman, she didn't know how to give it. "Because she never gave it to herself," Miss Marple said quietly. "She kept her secrets boxed away like wedding china, polished, unused, and heavy with meaning." Charlotte was silent for a long while. "I sometimes wonder," she said at last, "what she saw in me." "She saw someone who understood silence," Miss Marple replied. "That's rarer than you might think." The conversation drifted, and eventually Charlotte took her leave. It was in the days that followed that Miss Marple began to take her walks once more. She returned to her weekly presence at the market and resumed her mild observations of village life. But the murder, or rather, the death that revealed the motives of murder, had left her thinking more deeply than usual. The tea set, now finally, boxed and waiting to be passed on to an obscure cousin in Chichester, remained in her thoughts. 6 cups, 6 saucers. 1 cup moved out of alignment. Not an accident, a message. That 6th cup had been placed back in haste by the one who had picked it up intending to drink, then deciding not to, or by someone who had removed it entirely and later replaced it so the symmetry would not betray their presence. A gesture made by someone used to hiding their trail, a lawyer. a man who once forged ledgers, a ghost who lived with the memory of having taken the fall for another man's crime. It was Charlotte, in a second letter she delivered several days later, who provided the final unintentional piece of insight. She had found, among Petula's effects, a photograph. A black-and-white print of the Haraway estate from the 1930s. In the margin, written in Petula's hand, were the words, "The only place I ever told the truth." Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. It showed Petula as a young woman, standing in front of the conservatory, the windows flung open behind her. In her hands was a teacup, alone, and there at her feet, half obscured by the edge of the photograph, was a wicker chair, and what appeared to be the sleeve of a man's coat. The photograph had been trimmed on one side. Miss Marple placed the photo beside the old Harvest Fate program. The initials matched. The moment matched. The truth, she thought, was always visible, but never in the center of the frame. Always. At the edge, waiting to be noticed. Chief Inspector Crayford paid her one last visit before closing the case officially. "I must say, Miss Marple, your insights made this case feel like walking through fog with a candle. Never quite bright, but always leading somewhere." Miss Marple smiled. "Fog is often full of meaning, Inspector. The trick is not to clear it, but to watch what moves within it." He chuckled, then grew serious. "Do you believe justice was done?" She paused, considering. "No," she said softly, "but I believe something deeper was accomplished. Truth was spoken aloud, and people who thought they could go on unseen were reminded that silence has its own shape, its own weight." He nodded. "I'll be on my way then." As he departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern she worked was slow and intricate, a lace border of interlocking knots and petals, like secrets threading through a garden. Outside, the clouds had finally lifted. Sunlight streamed through the ivy-draped windows, glinting off the edge of the porcelain vase where she had placed a single lilac stem. The scent was faint but unmistakable, and though Beechwood on Thyme had returned to its rituals and rows of biscuits and polite nods, Miss Marple knew the difference. Because now when someone poured tea, they paused first, if only for a moment, and glanced around the room before they lifted the pot. And in that tiny hesitation, the village remembered. That one summer there had been a tea set laid out for 6, and a guest who had never been announced. The days that followed passed with the measured rhythm only a village like Beechwood on Thyme could maintain after scandal. Lavender House stood silent behind its wrought-iron gate, its windows shuttered, and its garden now managed by a distant cousin of the Haraway family, who had little fondness for roses, and even less for gossip. But inside the memories of those who had lived in Petula Haraway's shadow, who had observed her dominance in council meetings, choir rosters, and charity raffles, there lingered a certain unease. It was not grief, exactly, nor was it quite relief. It was a curious kind of discomfort, the sort that comes not from tragedy, but from the quiet shock of truth laid bare. And Miss Marple, whose mind had long since begun weaving the final stitches of the case, sat in her parlour one evening, gazing at the now dried lilac stem in her vase. There had been enough facts, enough fragments, to point to the guilt of Henry Graham, if not legally, then certainly in moral complicity. But Miss Marple was never one to stop at the first appearance of resolution. She had lived too long and seen too many crimes, those of passion, of cruelty, of vanity, to believe in tidy endings. It was with this certainty that she accepted a quiet invitation from Charlotte Vine to return to Lavender House for one final walk-through before the solicitor locked the doors. The house had been emptied of most valuables. Only the furniture, a few paintings, and the echo of old grievances remained. They walked together down the lilac path, the blooms now thinning, their scent fading, "I suppose someone else will live here now," Charlotte said, her voice low. "Eventually," Miss Marple replied. "But it will never quite be someone else's house." They entered through the conservatory, the same one where Petula Harroway had faced her final morning. The room had been cleaned, dust sheets drawn over the furniture, but it was not sterile. It still held, in the grain of the floor and the corners of the glass, the shape of something unsaid. Miss Marple walked slowly to the writing desk in the adjoining sitting room. She drew open the central drawer and found it, just as she remembered, a silver letter opener shaped like a slender dagger, still gleaming, still unused. "I asked myself," she said, not turning to Charlotte, "why someone like Petula would have taken the risk of inviting Henry Graham back into her life at all. She could have denied him entry. She could have had the solicitor report him, or written a final clause that disinherited him with legal force." Charlotte remained silent. Miss Marple turned. She allowed him to come, because she believed she could control him. She had done it once before, paid him to disappear, promised silence in exchange for obedience. But she underestimated one thing. Charlotte looked at her. "What was that?" "Desperation," Miss Marple replied, "and the weight of too many years gone unacknowledged." They stood there, two women of similar age but different histories, surrounded by the shadows of choices made and paths not taken. "I also asked myself another question," Miss Marple continued. "Why in her final days would Petula choose to plan a tea party with 6 cups when only 5 guests were expected?" Charlotte blinked. "5 confirmed guests," Miss Marple said, "and yet 6 cups set. 1 guest not listed, 1 seat not publicly reserved." Charlotte said nothing. "Did you know," Miss Marple asked gently, "that she planned to confront him here, that she was preparing for that moment?" Charlotte's shoulders lowered. "She told me she was expecting an old visitor. Someone whose presence would be," she said, "cathartic. I assumed she meant Harriet." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "She meant Graham, but she never expected to die. She expected to win. She thought she could use him one more time, to tie off the past like trimming an old thread. But she didn't know what his presence would unearth in herself." Charlotte sat on the edge of the chaise lounge. "She kept a letter." "She said?" "A real one. I found it, tucked into the lining of a drawer upstairs, not addressed to anyone. Just words. It wasn't legal. It wasn't part of the will. It was like she was writing to someone she used to be." She handed it to Miss Marple. The paper was thin, the handwriting wobbled but legible. "If I could tell the truth now, it would be this. I punished people not for their crimes, but for the way they reminded me of mine. I never forgave Leonard for what he did, but I stayed silent because the ruin would have included me. I thought paying Henry was justice, but it was cowardice. I gave my silence a price, and it returned to me with interest." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. "She knew," she said softly, "and that's why she left the clause, not just to name him, but to name herself." The room was quiet for a long time. At last, Charlotte asked, "Do you think we're all like that, Jane? Just waiting for someone to pour the tea and look us in the eye?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No. Some of us are pouring the tea, some are cleaning the cups, but all of us, I think, are sitting at a table we didn't expect to be at." They left Lavender House that afternoon. The door was locked behind them, the keys handed to the solicitor, the garden already beginning to overgrow. The following Sunday, Miss Marple sat in her usual pew at St. Mildred's. The service was subdued, the hymn soft. Afterwards she lingered in the churchyard, looking out across the village that now hummed with its old familiar quiet. Crayford joined her briefly. "I had a letter from the Home Office," he said. "They won't be prosecuting, not Graham, not anyone. Too many threads, too many years, and no clean conclusion." Miss Marple nodded. "Justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears memory." He smiled. "I'll remember that." As he walked away, Miss Marple sat quietly on the bench beneath the yew tree. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small slip of paper. It was the original garden party list. 6 names written in Petula Haraway's hand. 5 guests. And 1 extra line crossed out and then scribbled in again. Graham unconfirmed, then later, yes, a guest who never knocked. Who left without tea, and who carried a lifetime's debt in silence. Miss Marple folded the paper and tucked it back into her bag. She did not need justice from a court. She had seen the truth. She had seen it in the misaligned teacup, in the scent of lavender on a borrowed coat, in the shape of a name spoken only once. And like all her quiet victories, she let this one rest where it belonged. Among secrets and lilacs and the knowledge that truth, no matter how slowly it brews, always, inevitably comes to the table.